morning and welcome to another episode of The High Ground powered by Premier Companies. And Ryan, we're back in the podcast room.
Yeah, good to be back.
You
had a couple of weeks without me, so I'm glad to be back.
You know, our listeners, they tell us they listen for education and entertainment, and you told me a joke right before we got in here. Why don't you start us off with that one? That was pretty clever.
Well, okay, the question is, what did socialists use to light their homes before candles?
What did socialists use to light their homes for candles? I don't know, Ryan. What did they use?
Electricity. So you can laugh at that. You can laugh at that.
Well, you know, since we're a capitalist country, I don't think that's going to alienate any.
I would hope
listeners.
I would hope it does not. I would hope it does not. It may tip our hand to where we fall on the spectrum, but yeah. I thought that was a good joke.
But we got a house guest tonight that'll she'll probably appreciate that joke whenever she comes over. We have a few discussions in the kitchen.
Exactly. No, sounds good. So that's how we're starting it off with neither education or entertainment. So
well, there's our CEO just walked by and poked his head in the window there, looking in the podcast room. So he'll get a kick out of that too, baby.
He's still aggravated by the fact that he has less views than our last crop podcast. So Co-op History did not get the views that our last crop podcast did, and he's still upset about it. So.
However, I think our number one podcast download is our dinner discussion, so that doesn't say too much about it.
Right. Yeah, well.
Hey, we also have somebody else in the podcast room, our special guest, and Joe, we don't tell any of the other guests that they're special.
That's what I've heard.
But Joe Zimmerman is with us from the TRAX department. And Joe, just introduce yourself and let us know how you got here.
Yeah, thanks, Sal. So I am, I've been at Premier for about a year now, right out a year actually, just a little bit over, but I grew up in very remote rural Illinois, west central Illinois, so pretty isolated, and grew up with the farm background and all that stuff too, but I ended up going to the University of Illinois and worked a long time for, plant breeding for agrogenetics, worked on their yield trial team, basically traveling all over the state, doing a bunch of different research like that. And so now I met my wife, who was from Indiana, and she said, "Hey, we're moving to Indiana." I said, "Oh."
She didn't. It wasn't a flip a coin or anything like that.
Well, she was nice enough to move to Illinois for first couple of years of our marriage, and then obviously this opportunity came up, and I couldn't say no to that. So it was a tough sell, not really, because I was very, very happy to be here. But so now I am the TRAX Agronomy Lead for all of Premier, and I work out of the TRAX office here in Seymour with Braden Carpenter, who is our sustain lead, and Emily Neely, who just recently came on to kind of give us some support.
Yep, very good. And TRAX is our precision ag division, and I got to tell you though, so you're University of Illinois. So
yeah.
What's the fighting? What do they say? The fighting
Illini is their name. Yeah. So.
I've got a funny story. My wife is a saint, and but she doesn't follow a lot of.
What school's that? No.
Yeah, she's a saint for putting up. We're traveling out west. We was going actually to Iowa. I had a meeting out there, and she was riding along. She was finishing her degree and another degree she was getting. But anyway, and we was getting along. We stopped in a town just outside of Springfield, I think, and we're sitting in this place having dinner, kind of a sports bar, and she looks over at me and she goes, "What are Elini?" And I go, "Elini," and I looked around up there they had the jerseys up on the wall, the Fighting Illini, and I was like, "Oh boy."
It is tough being in Hoosier and Boilermaker country, and then people are kind of like, wait, what?
Yeah.
What school did you go to?
Definitely a minority in the.
Why are you here? So it's
Well, I'm a WKU grad, so if you talk slow, I'll usually get it. So.
All right, back to So Joe, tell us a little bit about. So I guess fundamentally in our TRAX department, and we spell that TRAX, but in our TRAX department, basically we've got soil data and nutrition, kind of on one side, and the other side we also have sustainability. and Braden's been in here and done a talk about sustainability in agriculture. But the part that you do is really very sustainable. Tell us a little bit about how we start the process with a grower to find out how much fertilizer they need.
Yeah, so I mean that's not really there is an easy answer, but there's a very complex basis of questions we need to find out before we can answer all of that. But essentially, we offer a crop link package that kind of is a total encompass of everything we offer. That's going to offer our grower the best value for them, and we kind of have the 4 R's, right, for soil fertility. So that's going to be the right source, the right rate, the right time, and the right place. So what does that mean? Right source, what product are we using? Where does it come from? Is it going to be the most beneficial option? Right rate, how much are we going to put on? You don't want to put, if your soil can't handle, if it's calling for, hey, you need whatever, X amount, but the soil can only handle Y amount, why are we putting on too much? We don't want to do that either. That's not good for the end result, the consumer or its pocket, the bottom line, because you're wasting product.
Sure.
Not good for the environment, not good for your budget. Right time, so that's pretty important as well. Obviously, there's certain times of the year that make more sense to apply than other times, and we want to get it in the right place, right? If traditionally the thought was let's just do a straight rate across the whole field, and if we catch the spots we need, great, and the spots that we didn't catch, well, we'll hit them again next year, and hopefully it'll catch it.
Yeah, and what we call a straight rate is where we just take a certain analysis of fertilizer and we apply it. We take trucks out in the field and we just spread it on at even 200 or 300 pounds or 400 pounds across the entire field. So how do you?
Correct.
So how do you get started? Tell us about so what do you do with the testing? How do you find out?
Well, the first thing, we recommend that we test. A grower would test the soil on a 4-year rotation. That's going to give us a good look of what nutrients have been depleted. You can do it more often, but it's really the threshold we find is about 3 or 4 years. 4 years being optimal because it's a nice, clean, even cycle.
2-year rotation.
2-year rotation, correct. So yeah, we it's important to see what things are being deficient, what things are too much. Like we don't want to put too much on any one kind of nutrient as well. So I guess your question was tell us the process.
Yeah, so we're looking for plants like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium.
Yes,
right?
correct.
Nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. So tell us a little bit about how you find that out. How do you go out and test a field?
Right, the process. So yeah, we've got about 4 or 5 different soil crews that we send out, and usually in the fall, can be summer, but usually in the fall and spring is the most common. And what they'll do is they'll go out and sample with these. We've got these Wintex probes that are very, the latest and greatest, state of the art. It allows them to work very efficiently and quickly. And what we'll do is we'll go to a point in the field, and what we try to do is, we say 2.5 acre grid is optimal, but really we go less than that. We average 2.3. And we want to make sure we get a good representation across all fields. So they're out there. They'll take 8 different cores for a single point, right, within that 2.3 acre grid, and then from there it's a very strict protocol process we have. From the time that sample is taken, it gets boxed up and shipped to our analysis lab, which is SureTech in Indianapolis, and from there that's where they can use all their fancy equipment and analyze, hey, what is the phosphorus level, what is the potassium levels, what are the microbes looking like? The magnesium, the manganese, the zinc, copper, all that. So
okay, and so this it's a Wintex probe.
Yes. Yep.
So we'll probably try to put a picture of that up on so the viewers can see, the ones that watch on YouTube. And you do 8. What's a core?
So core is, think of I guess the common folk might not know what a soil probe is, but a core would be like I don't know exactly the diameters of a soil core. I think it's like a 1/2 inch or something like that. And so the cores we aim for an 8-inch core is ideal for us.
So you go down 8 inches.
Correct. So these Wintex
8
probes,
different points.
Yes.
Every time you stop.
Correct. Yep. Every time you stop. So
I would ask a question from
Yes.
way back in the day. On an 8-inch probe, is there a difference in the depth that you go on a no-till field versus a conventional tilled field?
that's a good question. It depends a lot on what kind of litter's on top of the field too. But as far as no-till and till, as far as I know, the Wintex probes they're pretty consistent.
Stay consistent.
Regardless
Yeah.
of the soil type.
Okay.
It does not matter.
Okay.
Yeah, and we get, of course, in no-till, and we've got fields for the listeners that aren't familiar with that. That's where we just don't do any literally no tillage. So the name just describes a practice.
Yep.
And for various reasons, either it's a sloping ground that can have a lot of runoff from
Yes,
the rainwater,
correct. Yep.
and you want to keep the soil, and other times some of our ground's just so rocky. For those of our listeners that ever had the opportunity to go out in a field and pick up rocks.
Yeah, we live in a very unique geographical area. So years ago, when the glaciers came south, they kind of stopped right where our territory is. So we get a lot of mix of every different soil type you can just about imagine in our territory. A lot of rocky, a lot of sandy, a lot of some clay knobs, things like that. So it's very good that we're doing this sampling.
Yep. Also, you're looking for pH too. Can
Yes.
you tell us a little bit about?
Yeah, so pH is going to be our direct link to how much lime we need to put on a field, and if a soil is getting low in pH, that would make it much more acidic. So we are looking to increase the acidity to a more balanced pH to make growing crops optimal. So a lot of places in the field don't have low pH. They're a very great pH, and we don't need to put any lime there. So what we do is variable rate the lime. It kind of goes back to that straight rate conversation we had. And the savings alone from being, the cost of what it would take to sample a field gets paid for just by the variable rate lime savings that you would have.
Yeah, I had a customer one time that was going to go normal rate. He didn't want to pay for variable rate testing.
Right.
Too high.
Yep.
So he had an order in for 3 ton of lime on all of his acres. This was several thousand acres, and we finally got the discussion made, and he was like, "Well, let's variable rate it." And we made a little deal on the price of the lime. I told him, I said, "Your savings will all come from that lime.
Absolutely.
It'll take care of it."
It does.
And his whole entire farm averaged 3/4 of a ton over every acre
Oh,
versus
my gosh.
his 3 ton of the acre order that he had in. So I mean, even at an easy math at $10 a ton, it's
absolutely.
unreal savings that they had. I mean, this was 6,000 or 7,000 acres at that time. So
I tell you, it's that's one of the first things I believe that we fixed whenever we started doing precision farming, which really, 10 to 12 years ago is when it really became commonplace. And one of the first things we fixed was our pH levels.
Yep.
And that if the pH is out of whack in agriculture, it causes a host of problems, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's your foundation for sure. Just get your pH right, and then build out your fertility levels from there. It's a no-brainer to sample your field. Everybody should be doing it, I think, especially with the cost of inputs today. It's going to more than pay for itself.
We also have a lot of organic fertilizer, manure applications, right?
Yep, correct.
And
A lot of guys will put manure on, and that'll take care of a lot of their nitrogen needs. A lot of times, not always, but so we do some testing for that too. Pre-nitrate side dress test, or pre-side dress nitrate test.
Yep.
Got a little backwards there, but that's another thing that we offer within CropLink.
So we got it's neat that we have hogs. We've had Gary in for a swine link episode, but we take all that waste is not wasted, right? So we take the manure and
Correct.
whether it's turkey barns or chickens
Chicken litter,
or hogs,
yep.
all that gets applied, and we do samples. It sounds like a stinky job, but we'll send a sample into the lab.
Yep.
And
You can find out what kind of nitrogen you can expect to get from that various forms of manure.
good. So you get the sample results back, Joe. Then what? What do you do with that?
So we get the sample results back from the lab, and they automatically report to me. And we have this fancy software called Fieldalytics, and it is able to process recommendations based on. Well, I have to kind of enter in some parameters to kind of guide it to say, what kind of yields are you expecting? Do we want to use drawdown? Do we want to? All these different questions Once I get those answered for each, because every grower is unique on how they want to have their farm set up, but then the algorithm and it spits out a recommendation pounds per acre. What does this farm call for potassium needs? How much potash? How much DAP should we be putting on? That's your two basic questions: your potash and your DAP.
And what drives that is what their yield goals. How much?
Yeah, a lot of times. I mean, you want to be realistic on what you can get out of a farm, but also I don't want growers to shortchange themselves and not get optimal yield either. So it's important to get that right from the beginning. And then if they say, well, that's a lot less fertilizer than I was going to put on. Well, let's put a little more on then and see if you can drive your yield up. Or if it's too much, we can always back it off too. But usually the recommendation is there for a reason. We don't like to argue with the recommendation because it scientifically it says this is what your field needs, so this is what we should put on.
Yep. So that's this part of the process. Then what? So now you've got a recommendation. How do you take this data and send it out how do the applicators get the data? Tell us how that.
Yeah, so I'll get this data processed, and of course I work closely with account managers and the growers to see, make sure, hey, is this exactly what we think we want to put on? Yes, great. From there, I will dispatch it out to our various station managers who will basically relay it to their spreaders and their guys and work out a good, depending on weather, they'll be able to dispatch them to the corresponding fields in a timely manner, and variable rate, which is really cool, on their fields, put it exactly where it needs to go in the exact right amounts. And it's a very efficient and seamless process from start to finish.
So the variable rate applications,
yes,
those machines are already capable of doing that. So when you send them the map, how quickly? I mean, you're going to have zones. Clearly, you have different zones that you're going to run from 100 pounds in this spot to 400 pounds in this spot. Well, that machine can't change as instantaneously necessarily, but you blend your zones into where.
Correct.
So there's a little bit of a accommodation factor as they transition zones to get caught up, because that's a lot of difference. Somebody thinks about putting 100 pounds of potash on versus 400 pounds. We can't make that decision and change the machine within an inch. But
yes.
So
there is a little bit of a delay, but not enough to where you see.
It's fast.
It's very quick, yeah. And a lot of times when you see those soil results come back anyways, the zones, they're not always that drastic.
Right.
There is some shadings of gray where it kind of tapers off anyway, so it works in our advantage most of the time.
So one thing about variable rate testing that farmers got excited about in the early days of it was the no spread zones. Everybody loved the no spread zones because that required 0 tons. What, as far as recommendations go, necessarily leaving that at 0 is not necessarily the best call. So eventually that area will become deficient if you follow that map for 3 years. So what's your recommendation for those?
So we, if you don't touch it for, like you said, 3 or 4 years, it's gonna eventually all those nutrients are gonna get used up. That's why a lot of times when we do sampling, it'll ask, like, hey, this area calls for 50 pounds. Okay, well, that's really not enough to spread, but it's also not really enough to zero out. So we have to make those decisions with the account managers when it's time to come spread them. Do we want to go ahead and zero those areas, or do we want to? And if we zero them 1 year, then we got to say, okay, next year let's remember to go ahead and put the minimum on, which is 100 pounds.
Yeah.
Make sure we get something on this.
So generally speaking, we default to a minimum of pounds, and that way, we don't neglect
Correct.
an average area, I guess.
Yeah.
So
that's right.
We'll probably put some of these maps up on the overview also. Just put an application map just so the viewers can see what it looks like.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then the growing season starts, and then you do some tissue testing.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
To see how much the plant's actually taking up, correct?
Yep. Well, and we could back up a little bit if we wanted to talk about variable seeding recs, which actually happened before the tissue. This is something I'm really pushing and very excited for. Variable seeding it kind of goes back to that right place. It can apply to the seed as well. We want to optimize fields, just because, let's say you have a population of, I'm just going to say 36,000 for corn, and you were just going to plant the whole field for 36,000. Well, some of those areas of that field are actually going to be able to be bumped quite a bit higher, and you're missing out on potential yield. And right now with commodity prices, you don't want to do that. You're leaving money on the table. So what we can do is we can put in like little strip zones where we think that the farmer, I'll sit down with the farmer and his account manager and say, all right, what are the best producing spots of this field? Okay, let's go ahead and put a high density zone here just to see what we can get away with, but it's not increasing the overall population of the field, because then we'll go look at the lower producing spots of the field and back those off to where the average of the field still stays exactly the same. So does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And on the better soil, you plant a higher population.
Yep.
On some of the poorer soil, that'll maybe won't have the water holding capacity, or some you'll back those off.
Exactly. And a lot of fields are kind of around wood edges, which the critters and the shadows and stuff end up chipping away at those yields anyway. So why are we planting full populations there? A lot of times we'll just put a buffer zone in there. Well, that gives you a lot more average seed to play with across the rest of the field, because you just backed off the whole border. So now you can bump up those high production zones.
Yeah.
And a lot of planters are very capable of doing this, and this is something we offer free within CropLink, and I highly, highly recommend that everybody take advantage of it.
Yep. The one thing, you use lots of tools to figure out that population. Sometimes you'll use NDVI imagery from the previous growing season, and you can kind of get some insight. And then a lot of it becomes intuitive. The grower can tell you, as a grower sits and looks at his fields on a map, on a big display that you've got on the wall up there or in one of the offices, they can see like, well, that would be that sand bank or that sandy hill.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the NDVI is nice, but it doesn't. It gets us so far, and we can take a pretty good guess at where the good zones are, but having that farmer go over each, they know their field better than anybody, right? They know where the high yields are. They can pull up historic yield maps. They can look at, this is a wet hole. We got to back it off here, or whatever it be. We can look at slope, elevation, soil type. Just let's get your field planted the way that makes sense.
I like how you do that. You have the account manager in there that knows the hybrids, and the farmer, they know the hybrids, so they know what the limitations are as far as population. The farmer knows the fields, you know the data, and you bring everybody together and get the best recommendation.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. And then I guess going forward, you were asking about tissue sampling, which would be the next thing that we get involved in. So, very early, not super early, but corn, the beans and corn will start to merge. And then we like to do tissue sampling at the various stages for each crop. We will send we've got teams that go out and do this, and then very similar to how we do the soil, they will collect samples in a bag, ship them off to the lab. Lab analyzes them, sends the data back to me in a PDF or spreadsheet, and then we can analyze what is deficient as far as nutrients, and we can get that adjusted, kind of like a course correction before the seed starts setting, before our yields are really starting to take effect. So that way we can kind of get ahead of the curve, which is a very useful tool.
So previously we had macronutrients.
Yes.
That's the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. So those are in hundreds of pounds that we apply. And then now you're looking at micronutrients, like boron or zinc or manganese. And those are taken up by the crop in tenths of pounds or pounds per acre. Right. And we're easier to go in and make a foliar application of one of those micronutrients and make sure there's no limiting factors as far as the plant's concerned.
Yeah, that's right.
And when we talk about limiting factors, I think we can even put up that diagram that we talk about, the lowest stave on the barrel, that regardless whether it's a micro or a macro, the plant's ability to produce and reach its optimum yield, it will be limited by whatever nutrient is limited, regardless of whether it's a macro or micro, which is why this consistent testing all the way through the growing season is important.
Yeah, and all the way through, there's several different stages we can look at. Now, I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but for those agriculturally inclined people who know these stages, I'll just go ahead and rattle them off. For corn, we're looking at V4 to V8, V9 to V12, and then VT to R5. Beans will be V3 to V5, R1 to R3, and then R4.
Okay.
So
we might as well throw in the carbon to nitrogen ratio too while you're at. You want to go ahead and jump into that?
Yeah.
So now we'll just to summarize it up and bring it home, and then harvest happens. The plants reach physiological maturity.
Yes.
The grower goes out with a big combine and removes the grain, and then what do you do with the data that comes off the field, the yield maps?
Yeah, so we've got their yield data now. The farmer is got all this grain, and he's either pleased or expectations have been met, or he's upset. Those are the three options generally. And so we've got the yield maps, and we can upload those into our software, so that when we write recs, that's another layer that we add onto the soil data, the nutrient levels in the soil, the soil types. These are all things that we can add in to build future recommendations. So if the yield says it's X and we're trying to get to Y, then we can apply that layer as well. And then next year when we're writing these recs, we can really push those envelopes to get expectations where they would like to be.
So now you've got another tool, so you know exactly. So you got a data point. You knew how much you're supposed to put on as far as fertilizer and nutrients.
Correct.
You know how much crop you have removed, and so now you know how much you've got to replace.
Yes.
And so you've got this. It becomes a circle, doesn't it?
Yeah. That's a good point that I should definitely touch on is build factors versus removal factors. Like you said, that would tell us the removal, the yield. So we could build a recommendation strictly on removal only. So what did this year's crop take off? Which this past season, prices of fertilizer were
pretty salty.
Yes. So that was a very common thing that we saw. Now, of course, the guys that were in the middle of builds, they could either push pause or they could do a reduced build. And then you had the growers that just powered on through and just said, we're trying to get to a goal. Let's just get it done. So.
Stay the course.
Exactly. So.
All right.
Okay. Well, to wrap that up, you have layers and layers and layers of
All
data
kinds
that
of
goes into those crops every year. The soil testing, the tissue testing, plant population, satellite imagery, yield maps, removal rates, slope, elevation, soil type. So just as I started the podcast, I'll finish this podcast to remind everyone. In 2016, a presidential candidate began a small rant on what it took to be a farmer. As he said, I could teach anybody, even the people in this room, to be a farmer. It's a process. You dig a hole, you put a seed in it, you put dirt on top of it, water it, and up comes the corn. So I'm not sure exactly how many layers there takes to be a 3-time mayor of New York City or president, but I don't think there's as many layers as there are to plant a crop.
Yeah, it's easy to plant crop. Didn't you know that?
Oh yeah, it is amazing. I think agriculture is one of the biggest, largest consumers of technology, and people don't realize how much is invested in a crop before you. And then there's so much that can help happen. We looked at a soybean field just yesterday that had a hailstorm come through. And there's a lot of risk
there is
in a growing season, and you have to know how to navigate through it all.
Yep. I guess a couple points. I don't know how close we're wanting to wrap up here, but I've got a couple things I want to
Sure.
get across before we.
Yeah, we'll cut it when you're done. It's fine.
It's fine.
No.
I'm kidding.
I guess. I've got stats, but one thing I want to kind of mention is, we've got all this data, but what good is a data to grower if it's not optimized to work for the grower? So anybody can have layers and layers of data, but I guess you got to be able to interpret it and make good sense of it for what the specific goals of the grower wants to accomplish, I think.
Yeah, because you have, and you and Braden have both told me and coached me that data and information are not the same thing.
Correct.
And we get piles of data, and I guess that's a good thing to let Joe, glad you led us there, because that's what you do every day is try to make sense of all the data points and turn that into usable, actionable information
right.
that we can make decisions with.
And another thing, some growers might get hung up on looking at the wrong areas of data, and they just can't take their eyes off of a certain thing that really isn't that big of a factor or deal. And I have to point them in a direction and say, look, your ground's actually pretty fertile. It's very profitable. You need to look at all these good things. You're just focusing on this one small thing that's easily correctable.
Yeah.
But I also have our last season soil statistics. If
okay.
you'd like to hear
yeah,
them.
I understand that some of these levels with our best efforts are still declining. Some of the potassium levels in Indiana they still have a downward trend, even though we're trying our best.
Yes.
But the yields are keep improving. So what kind of stats do you have for us?
Well, if we've got a moment here, I've got. So I did I pulled some numbers over the last couple weeks here, and so we service over 1,450 growers across 25 counties with soil.
Just in TRAX.
Just in TRAX.
Wow.
Yep. Just on the agronomy side within TRAX. So, and last season we sampled 65,000 acres of soil, which averaged, again, like I said, a 2.3 acre grid. So that would have been 28,261 samples. And of course, there's 8 cores per sample, as you know. So that's 226,088 cores.
Let's just call that $250,000 just for the heck of it.
250,000 cores.
Like using Sal math.
So if you take how much an average core weighs, that's 42,391 pounds of soil, or 21.2 tons of soil that we shipped to the lab. So what they do with all that when it's done, they don't send it back to us, so I don't know where it goes, but.
It goes out in the dump truck. I do remember that
because it's ground up so fine. But they do reuse
tight.
that. But that's amazing that we take in 8-inch, less than 1-inch core samples diameter that we're taking. We're sending in over 20 tons of samples.
Yep.
And just to put that in perspective, those cores, by the time you put eight of them in a bag, it's probably only 2 pounds maybe.
Yeah, I think it's a pound and a half.
About a pound and a half
what we figured,
of soil,
something like that.
So that's amazing that 250,000 cores.
That's a lot of labor.
A big shout out to UPS.
Yes.
No kidding. And then we also figured out that with our Wintex probes and our rigs, our soil crews, assuming no breakdowns, assuming good weather, assuming everything's going well, we can sample 150 acres an hour.
Wow.
So at maximum speed to cover all the acres we did this year. That's if everything was going perfect. That's 433 man hours to get it done.
That's amazing. Wow.
So
thank you
job.
for bringing that. Yeah, that was. Yeah.
I just thought maybe listeners might be interested in hearing some of the stats.
Yeah. We ought to put a video on of what you all do to a brand new mule or side by side when you get them. They take and the first thing they do is a beautiful machine, and then they cut a hole right in the floorboard.
First thing you do is destroy it.
Yeah.
What's all these factory parts on here? We don't want these.
What is this nonsense?
It looks like that too. It's heartbreaking because you see this beautiful machine show up, and then Lou or somebody else out there throwing parts.
We'll not need this.
Well, don't need that. Don't need this.
Exactly. Yeah. This doesn't mean no good. We got to get rid of this. This has to go immediately.
Yeah.
But yeah, I got a funny story real quick if we got time. I just moved houses.
Yeah.
And of course I moved to Indiana last year, so we've been renting, but been building a house slowly and finally moved last week. And
that's not a stressful process.
Well, not at all.
Congrats.
Doing a podcast is like cake compared to some of the things.
Hey, don't sell us out.
But you would not believe. Okay, so when we're designing this house, okay, let's put a shoe closet in just for you, honey, for the wife. Keep the spouse happy.
Easy killer.
I know.
This is a big wide world web out there.
And of course, yeah, well,
a shoe closet,
a whole shoe closet. And as we're moving things, I unbox one box of shoes. I think that's it. Nope. A second one. Nope. We did not have. I basically lost my closet. You know how Harry Potter lives under the stairs. That's that's my closet. That's what I've got going on.
Now, when you say boxes of shoes, you don't mean like the shoe box, right?
No, I mean like pairs of shoes. I'm like, how many? She got a different pair of shoes.
Like a big box full of shoes.
I should be nice. She's
how many garage spots did you get though? That's the question.
Well, I do get to have most of the garage, luckily. So there was some compromise there.
Every time we start doing wife stories in here, I get like secondhand anxiety that it's like we're going to get.
I got the green light to tease her as much as I want.
Okay.
So.
I've learned to stay real quiet during this part.
He threw me under the bus during the dinner discussion.
Sure did.
Well, Joe, I think that's all we got today.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you for joining us.
Sure thing.
And
Joe, thanks for all you do.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys as well. Thanks for having me.
250,000 cores. That's a big deal.
Yep. And
So
we're always increasing, so we're aim for higher goals next year. So.
Good job. Well, that wraps up another episode of The High Ground, powered by Premier Companies.
Thanks
very much.